So my name's Jim Carafano. I'm the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policies here at the Heritage Foundation. Let me thank you all for coming. The first thing is let me ask everybody if you've got something electronic that makes funny noises, if you could turn it off or dampen it or whatever. Except if you're listening online, you go ahead. Have that. We often start slightly late here at Heritage, but we always end on time. So I promise that we will end precisely at 1 o'clock. And we're going to jump right into our panel because this is a fascinating discussion that I've long been looking forward to. Before we begin, I would like to thank our partner, the National Review. This is, I think, I can't remember, second time we partnered on these things, and they've been just it's been a great partnership. The National Review is an awesome product online and in paper, and it's been terrific to use that partnership to really talk about some really very valuable and useful things and really have the kind of dialogue that you see all too seldom in Washington, D.C. So we're very excited to do this, and I will just very briefly introduce our panel and have that. I hope that it actually, I know it's kind of framed as a debate, but I hope actually it's not a debate, because personally I think that is probably the least useful thing to have, because debates are about winners and losers, not actually about solving problems. And the one thing I think our panel all agrees is that these are actually problems that ought to be solved, because the future of what our country looks like is determined by that. So I think that identifying clear points of differences, but also clear areas where there's consensus is really what's incredibly valuable about this, and just really advancing understanding of how we look at different issues. If you look at the conservative movement at large, for example, this is not a new or unexpected challenge at all. There have always been very different, when you look at the notion of protecting a society and maximizing the freedom and individual liberty in the society, there have always been kind of multiple strains which have fed into the modern conservative movement. So on the one hand, you have kind of the Burkean concept of ordered liberty, and Burke was particularly influenced by the excesses of the French Revolution. And you would wonder if he was around today, what do you think of Egypt? He'd probably be going oh, deja vu. But Burke was very concept that the society that also has an obligation to create the ordered society in which liberty could exist, and the challenge was to find not a balance, because balance isn't the right word, but to find ways to secure liberty, to provide for the security of the state and also and the people of the state, but at the same time maximize individual freedom and liberty. And that was the notion of ordered liberty. But there's also in the strain that's come into the modern conservative movement the notion of the open society, which is the greatest threat to individual freedom is the state itself. And the only absolute guarantee is to have as minimal government intervention into the life of average individuals as possible. Part of the reason why conservative movement became a powerful, not just intellectual force, but a powerful political force in the 21st century is those two groups of people figured out how to live together. And the way, and not that they haven't argued over the decades, but the way they've often found common ground is by actually in their common purpose, which is to see the people flourish and to find answers that were practical and reasonable. And that's really been the glue, which is, in a sense, created the modern conservative movement, held it together over time. So I'm not that I'm putting out a challenge to these guys or anything to save the next generation, but we have three people that are perfectly capable of doing that. So Jim Geraghty's going to go first. He's long been a contributor to the National Review, and his writing is sparkling and interesting and always stimulating, and so he's the perfect person to have in this discussion. We're really glad we're really pleased that Debbie Rose could be with us. She's a fellow at the Association of Competitive Technology, and to really help kind of provide an industry perspective, who I think sometimes feels like the person kind of caught in the middle between two arguing siblings. And then Paul Rosenzweig, who's an old friend and visiting fellow at Heritage, and who has dealt with these issues from many perspectives, inside and outside of government. He was the number 2 guy at the policy department in the Department of Homeland Security. So he's seen this debate from all sides, and now he's a private consultant, so he's seen it from the private sector side as well. So with that brief introduction, let me turn it over to each of you guys to kind of make opening statements, and then we'll just have a free-flowing discussion from there. And then I think at some point, do we have microphones? Is there a guy with, no, not you guys. Do we have people with microphones? Oh, you do? Okay. Yeah, at some point we'll try to get in some questions from our friends before the end of the hour. So Jim, over to you.
I want to begin today. Everyone hear me okay? No, it's not that big a room. How many of us had a cell phone on September 11th, 2001? Okay, so some of us did, some of us didn't. Apparently, back in 2001, it was about 128 million Americans. It's now up to about 300 million Americans. That comes out to roughly 90%, according to Pew Research. And then it comes out to about 56% have something like this, a smartphone, which means it's not just a phone. It's got a camera, which is taking photos. It's got a GPS tracking device. And so, when we have these discussions, President Obama will emphasize that no one's listening into your calls. They're only looking at the metadata. Well, the content of your phone calls might be the least interesting thing on your phone compared to the tracking data and the photos you take and everything else.
That's good. I think
the laws governing our surveillance state were passed about 12 years ago, and technologically we're in a completely different era. Back when the Patriot Act passed, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, no Instagram, no YouTube, there wasn't even MySpace. For the kids watching at home, MySpace was this ancient program we did. And since 9/11, we've all become really, really comfortable with the idea of putting lots and lots of stuff onto our social networks and sharing things that we think we're not sharing with the whole wide world. And now it turns out some people are looking on. We're sharing with a lot more people beyond our friends. It turns out we all signed up for Verizon's Share Everything plan. The CBS television show Person of Interest is about the creator of a massive government surveillance and data mining computer. And it stars the bad guy from Lost and Vigilante Jesus. And they go around and stop crimes, and there's a scene where the bad guy from Lost says that he found it too hard and complicated back when he worked for the intelligence agencies to get people's personal information. So he invented a way where everybody would give it up voluntarily, social networking. So when we hear about the vast surveillance abilities of the National Security Agency today, we react differently from 10, 11 years ago because it's a completely different world. We use all this technology completely differently. Now you notice this doesn't really break down along the usual left-right divide. It's not really about whether you're a liberal or conservative. The more you see the discussion of the NSA, you begin to realize it comes down to, do you have a security clearance or not? Democrats and Republicans who have a security clearance keep telling us this is a perfectly legitimate, really necessary, awesome program. It could never be abused. It's nothing like the Internal Revenue Service. Now some of these people who say this are people I respect a great deal and they're really smart, and some of the people who say this are Joe Biden. Some of the people who say this are dedicated, public servants who are very good and very honest, and some of the people who defended are Eric Holder. So those of us who don't have a security clearance, those of us who are outside government, are not quite so reassured. Now, a big reason that we're having this discussion is because of a guy named Ed Snowden. Working in media and writing about a lot of media topics for National Review, I was kind of struck by how quickly the coverage of this went from, hey, here's what the NSA is doing right now, to kind of this personality story and kind of this binary choice. Is Ed Snowden a hero or a traitor? So apparently there's no in-between, and there's no way he could simultaneously be usefully informing the American public of what our government's doing and simultaneously telling our enemies exactly what we're doing as well. Now from where I come down, I think the defenders of the NSA have a problem. And it's that the more that they criticize Snowden, often accurately and often fairly, the worse they look. Because the moment he started going down to China, and then he decides to go eat McBorscht in the Moscow McDonald's airport McDonald's for weeks, he looked at best like a man who's got enormous naivete, and at worst he's a foreign agent. The problem is, the NSA hired this guy, and within like a couple of months they gave him the keys to the kingdom. So the dumber and more sinister Ed Snowden is, the worse the NSA looks. The other problem, and this is where I get into my whacking around the Obama administration like a piñata part of this presentation, is that they really poisoned the water hole of this debate by lying to the public from the beginning. Because all too often, when somebody in authority is trying to reassure us what the NSA is doing, it turns out to be a lie. Well, either it's a lie or they don't really know what they're talking about. Like when President Obama told Charlie Rose that the FISA court is transparent. Only in Obama land is a court where everything is secret characterized as transparent. Now also, this is a FISA court, so there is no equivalent of a defense attorney speaking on behalf of the person who's going to be investigated. This is not an adversarial court. Nobody speaks for you, Joe Citizen. The government makes its case, and the judge either says, okay, you can look into that stuff, or it says, no, I'm not convinced. You can guess how that turns out. Since the start of the War on Terror, the FISA court has denied 10 applications, modified several dozen, and approved more than 15,000. So, I don't know about you, but I'm left wondering, with an approval rate of 99.99%, what the heck do you have to ask for to get your request denied? Your Honor, we absolutely, positively have to look at the photos on Scarlett Johansson's cell phone. It is a matter of national security. You'll recall that James Clapper found out under oath that the NSA had never gathered any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of Americans. He later claimed he misunderstood the direct question posed to him and apologized to Congress. Now, when your excuse is that you don't understand what any data means, I think you should no longer be allowed to have the word intelligence in your job title. Or when President Obama says to Jay Leno, we don't have a domestic spying program, and then we learn, as we did last week, that the NSA gathers tens of thousands of emails and electronic communications on lots of Americans who have nothing to do with terrorism. I mean, you begin to understand why President Obama is doing these interviews with Jay Leno instead of, say, Jake Tapper or Bret Baier. So I was willing to believe that the real issue was not the NSA, and the problem really was the administration, and that most NSA employees were good folks just trying to do their job, just trying to protect the country, and that the most honorable crowd this side of Dudley Do Right. And then we found out they were using all their technology to spy on their ex-wives and ex-husbands and ex-girlfriends and ex-boyfriends. And that they even have a term for it called love int. Senator Dianne Feinstein tried to assure us that this is a rare series of isolated incidents. Think about that phrase for a while, the series of isolated incidents. I'm going to quote the John Woo cinematic masterpiece, Broken Arrow, starring John Travolta and Christian Slater, and there's a line he says, I don't know what's scarier, the fact that this happens, or the fact that there's actually a term for it. So there's a reason we have all this new suspicion of the NSA and our domestic surveillance state, and I think that I think that something is going to have to change. And I think the recent vote you saw, which basically split the Republican caucus down the middle, indicates that this is not, it's well beyond the long-haired hippies making these complaints. I think that there are a lot of Americans who are growing naturally skeptical. If this had not occurred several months after the IRS scandal, we might look at things very differently. But we've just learned that large government institutions that collect lots of data on Americans and are supposed to be totally nonpartisan and totally beyond abuses can do precisely that. So I think I think that the status quo is pretty untenable with the way that the NSA operates under this administration.
Great, thanks, David.
There's no way I'm gonna be that entertaining.
Well, you have to apply, promise to apply anyway, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, just set expectations. I'm here to represent the industry perspective. We, ACT, the Association for Competitive Technology, represents thousands of small software developers, mostly the app industry, that's putting all that cool stuff on the phone that you guys all love so much and we just talked about. Our industry is growing like crazy and we're interested in continuing that effort. We understand the consumers that we care very much about privacy issues, as do we. And we want to make sure that we're able to continue making amazing apps that change your lives and that you are finding useful in every aspect of your life. And in order to do that, we need to have clarity and a clear and concise roadmap for us on the laws and regulations that apply to our industry so that we can keep on doing that. I look forward to taking more questions as we get into the discussion where we can flesh that out.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Wow.
Short and sweet.
I'm not ready yet. I thought I had another 4 or 5 minutes of you talking to get myself going on this one. Okay.
Filibuster.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna have to pretend that I'm Rand Paul and just talk about something for a long time without really saying anything. Sorry. Sorry about that. I too won't be nearly as entertaining as Jim is, and perhaps that's because I am probably closer to the Burkean end of this discussion of ordered liberty, and I think this is a serious topic that really deserves serious consideration. There's a lot of things that can be said about the NSA program and the balances or tensions between privacy and liberty on one hand and security on the other hand. I think one of the things, though, that can't be said is that perfection is the only result that is acceptable, right? We operate in a human environment where human actors are responsible for affecting policy. And the idea that we expect perfection out of NSA actors, that nobody will engage in love-int, is nonsensical. Just as it is nonsensical to expect that no police officer will ever misuse his government-issued firearm and the authority that he has. In fact, we know quite well that some fraction of police officers will shoot the wrong person by accident, will maliciously use their weapon in a rage of love-int to shoot their wife or husband's lover if they find them in bed, or will in fact go rogue, go over to the dark side and join in with the people that they're supposed to be investigating and use their weapons illegally on behalf of drug dealers or something like that. Do we, from that, derive the lesson that the police should not have guns? Answer, obviously, no. Why? Because we've made a judgment, an accurate judgment about costs and benefits, that the provenance of armed police in our cities does more to prevent crime and does more to make the general society safer and serves a legitimate government function of providing for the common defense, right out there, top line of the Constitution, does more to do that, to advance that interest, than the disbenefits, the costs that are naturally incurred when the system itself is imperfect, right? So there are really only two possible answers to a human system like that. One is to say that the costs are so great and the benefits so low that we're going to eliminate the capability altogether. That would be the equivalent of disarming the police. That would be the equivalent in social programs of saying that the incidences of welfare fraud are so great that we won't have a welfare program because we lose too much money in fraud and the benefits of welfare are not big enough. I don't subscribe to that view either, but that's the exact same argument. So the argument here is the system in place giving us enough benefits in terms of preventing adverse actions by America's enemies, and they remain there today, or to justify the cost. Now, I actually don't know the answer to that question, right? It's an empirical question, and I don't know it. I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know the answer because, of course, this particular part of the space operates in a classified environment, right? Unlike the cop analogy that I've been talking about for the first couple of minutes, where police officer shootings are routinely reported in the press and covered, etc., the classified space is not as well reported. So what's the answer to that? Well, one answer is complete transparency into the classified process. That doesn't work, though, right? The very reason that it's classified is that disclosing the nature and way in which the activity is operated will change behaviors of both our enemies and good people, right? So we don't want to do that. So we've developed a system of reasonably robust oversight, right? I mean, we talk about the NSA as if it is a rogue agency, and yet within the agency it has a privacy officer, a civil reason privacy officer, and an inspector general who routinely conduct investigations of what it does. It reports to an intelligence committee, which, Jim said, who speaks for us, in the FISA court? And I would have thought, well, the government, who are representatives of us, sort of speaks for us, right? Our elected legislators, they sort of speak for us. That's what representative democracy is all about. We can go to a world in national security in which only full-blown participatory democracy and everybody getting to make a decision is the model. But that, in the end, in essence, destroys the ability of the government to do anything in a classified environment. Michael Hayden, the former director of CIA, said it right. The NSA has a job. It's a job we gave them. It's to steal other people's secrets, right? Maybe we want to just stop. Maybe we want to say that we don't care about what the Syrian Electronic Army is going to do to the United States when and if President Obama launches an attack against Syria. For my money, I want to know that, and I want an agency that's devoted to that answer. Otherwise, we're disabled from acting in any way in the kinetic space just as readily as we are in the cyberspace. I think the final point I would make is this, right? The answer that we have is a kludge, right? It's not a clear black and white answer. It's a system where, to carry my police officer analogy, you try and hire the right people, you have internal oversight in case you don't, you have external oversight, you have internal punishments, and in the end, if police officers misuse their authorities, you criminally prosecute. In the national security space, we have all of the same oversight. It is just oversight that is delegated, all right, to a group of our fellow citizens whom we've decided to trust with this power. Maybe we should. Maybe we've decided after 50 years of this compromise, which grew out of the Church Commission, that delegated oversight doesn't work for us. But the answer is, anybody who tells you that the other answer is a fully transparent secret organization is telling you a myth. The other answer is we're going to shut the NSA down, right? More or less, or exceedingly disabled. And if that's what we want, that's fine, right? That's a collective judgment we can all make. But we will reap the whirlwind, I think. Does all this mean that the NSA is perfect? Absolutely not. Does it mean that I can't give you a half dozen improvements to the FISA system off the top of my head and changes to the law that I think would be better? Absolutely not. Happy to talk about those in the questions and answers. But, the kind of treating the NSA as a risible rogue agency that has nothing better to do with its time than look at Scarlett Johansson's pictures is kind of reducing the debate to a level that we ought to raise it up from there. And I'll stop there.
So let me see if I can just put a question. Okay, I can put it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Although, don't encourage him. Let me just see if I can put out a question for each of you to kind of put you a little on the spot. And let me start with Debbie, because one of the things the president says is he talked to Jay Leno, and he did some other more professional interviews as well, and he said, look, I recognize there's problems out there, but some of these things can be fixed with technology. So from a technologist perspective, how much of this can be fixed with technology? And are there technologies that are going to come out that are actually going to materially make people like Jim and me and Paul happier?
Well, from our industry, the app developers are out there trying to meet all the a host of needs, and from the health care system to education to defense industry issues. So yeah, I think that there's always technology available and on the horizon to solve some of these questions.
But can you, are there some specific things that are coming down the pike that will specifically address some of the issues that Jim raised, like just people getting in there and wrongly using the technologies, or better screening so you're not inadvertently looking at legitimate people's information? Are there things like that you can specifically say, yeah, we're going to have that tomorrow or next week or next year?
I don't have that information. I don't have as to what specific technologies, new technologies coming out to meet specific needs. I don't know that, but I can speak to what the industry as a whole is hoping with respect to the response to privacy concerns. And the knee-jerk response is always to there's legislation and there's regulation that can be applied to remedy the fear of these privacy invasions. We, as an industry, as app developers, we just know that we need some clear rules to the road so that we can know how to use private information correctly, that we're following the rules, and that government in the response tries to target the actor in the bad act, not necessarily the technologies, because it's not the technologies that we're creating that are bad, it's the bad actors in our space. And we are really trying very hard to, as an industry, focus on punishing the bad actor, not the technology.
Let me just try to get through this round, and then we'll get back and folks can kind of respond to all that. So the question I have for Paul is, one of the things that Jim raised seems like a very kind of, you said there's things out there we can do to make it better. So one of the things Jim raised, which sounds like kind of a common sense thing, is, well, what's this idea of a public advocate? So could you actually explain what a public advocate is and whether that's...
Well, that's an
Good
interesting
idea.
question, and, you know, it's a lot more, challenging than the simple name goes. I mean, right now, when the government goes in front of the FISA court and presents it
And could you explain what the word FISA means?
It's FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is the law that Congress passed in the wake of the Church Commission activities to create a court that the government would have to go to get authorization to conduct surveillance of terrorists and other foreign agents. And the government is the only person who appears in front of the court and makes its case for the issuance of a warrant. The idea that's being advanced by people like Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut is that there should be a public advocate in there who would make the countervailing argument against government access to this information. The FISA court is not a unique model, right? Whenever the government seeks a warrant to break into your house, right, knock down your door, it goes what we call ex parte, without any public advocate or other person on the other side to make the argument against why they should be permitted to break down your door. So bringing a public advocate into the equation at the FISA court level would be something very new and different in the entire model of how the government conducts investigations widespread. That having been said, there's at least a portion of that seems a little sensible, which is not a public, because the overarching rules that the courts apply in the physical world about knocking over doors are generally set in contested proceedings after the fact, right? If I knock your door down, right, and I grab the drugs, and you say, oh, they used the wrong rule, when I charge you with a crime, you get to go into court and we have a contested proceeding, and Mr. A says that was bad, and the government says, no, it was cool, and we get it to litigate it in a public sphere with two sides presented. In the secret space, because a lot of it never gets to court, there aren't a lot of criminal prosecutions that go out. It's, you know, tracking down terrorists overseas or improperly tracking down, President Obama's political opponents here, or President Bush's political opponents here in the States. That often doesn't get to a place where there's a contested proceeding. So I could see, and this is me talking, right, not Heritage or anybody, but I could see a space for, at the FISA court's request, not in every case, because the application of law to the facts doesn't really need, but when they're making new doctrine, when they're saying metadata is within Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which is the decision that underlies one of these programs, when they could, if they wanted to, ask for a public advocate to come and say why that interpretation would be wrong, and make the pro-privacy, pro-citizen argument.
So
I could see that.
Let me throw out one more question, and then I'm going to go back to you guys and let everybody kind of police up on any responses and make anything. So, Jim, you raised a really interesting and fascinating point out across your argument is look, the real problem is this is a government that we really don't trust, right? And so my question is, you know, on the one hand, one of the things that we do here is we track terrorist attack aimed at the United States since 9/11. So by our count, there's 60. So 3 of them were successful. I probably get the numbers exactly wrong. 3 of them were successful. 3 of them were stopped basically by accident, the underwear bomber, the shoe bomber, the Times Square bomber. The rest of them were actually stopped by proactively going out and finding out who the bad guys were and stopping them before they did something. So, so how would you advise Congress, on the one hand, to say, you know, we like this idea that we're stopping terrorist attacks before they happen, that's very, very cool, but these are programs being run by an administration which we simply don't trust. So how would you advise Congress to move forward with that?
I really wish we'd change presidents. It made it a lot easier. And the second is, if you don't trust the administration, you have to watch it like a hawk. We talked a little bit about the concept. We mentioned about the terrorist attacks that have been stopped. Recently, when talking about this, President Obama said that we had not suffered a major attack on the homeland since 9/11, and I'm just curious about how that comment went over in Boston, since that seemed major enough to me, and that was a program in which these guys were watching YouTube videos of jihadist leaders over in Chechnya, and that was not detected by this. And oh, by the way, the Russians allegedly warned us about these guys. Now, we can argue about whether the Russians are all that trustworthy, and maybe the Russians think every Chechnyan immigrant is a bad guy. I mean, like, there's potentially extenuated circumstances, but we know that this system does not have a 100% success rate. If it did, and they keep citing all these other attacks that they've stopped, that, unsurprisingly, I'm not pro terror attack.
Write that down.
You're not?
Yeah. However, I think there's one of the other problems. Not only is this an administration we don't trust, but the traditional systems of checks and balances and oversight have pretty much failed. When it reported that that 99.99% of FISA requests get approved over the last since 9/11, either the FBI is so totally awesome at their jobs that they never get it wrong, or most of these judges hear one side of the argument and say, okay. But the other also fears potentially that every judge doesn't want to be the guy who says, no, you can't look at that, and then, heaven forbid, a terror attack occurs. A complication of this whole system of checks and balances, I don't want to say the FISA court is a joke, but as we saw, the Department of Justice is looking into James Rosen of Fox News, when they were going to potentially charge him as being a co-conspirator in an effort to release classified information. Basically, they judge shopped. They went to one judge didn't like it, went to the second judge didn't like it, they went to a third judge. So if you can just keep going until you find a judge who says, yes, that's not really a check and a balance, and the third thing is you go to Congress. Well, no offense to the guy who's running Heritage right now or any of the fine members of Congress, but the institution that once had John Edwards and Anthony Weiner doesn't totally reassure me. These guys are totally up to the job of balancing these constitutional things. And the other thing is that congressional oversight really is a joke if the DNI can lie to Congress and then have absolutely no consequence whatsoever. So watch them like a hawk, and then watch for when they're lying, and when they do lie, beat them over the head with it.
So let me do this. I want to give folks in the audience an opportunity to kind of weigh in with their questions. Let me ask each of you. We'll start with Paul and just work our way down. We've had some good back and forth here on different issues. So are there comments you want to kind of follow up on and flesh out a bit, and then we'll go to the audiences, and then if we have a chance, we'll come back and wrap up.
I'll make a couple of quick points in response to a couple of things that you asked my colleagues here. The first is about trusting the president. In 2003, 2004, I went around the country, and I gave a speech, the working title of which was "John Ashcroft is not Darth Vader," right? And it was in the midst of a time of what I called Bush derangement syndrome, in which everybody thought that the Patriot Act was evil. John Ashcroft was the personification of that, and that the valence has just switched, right, today. And I'm actually willing to go around the country and say, I know it's heresy in Heritage, but Eric Holder is not Darth Vader, right? He's not the Attorney General I would select. By any stretch of the imagination, his policies are not ones that I like in any way, and some of the things he's done, I think, run perilously close to the edges of legality, if not over them. But, at the same time, Jim's view of the capabilities of self-governance is so dim. I mean, think of it. He doesn't trust the judges, he doesn't trust the Congress, and he doesn't trust the president. So there's nobody left, right? And so that's just too dim a view for me. I prefer to think that they're all American citizens who want to do the right thing, who sometimes wind up doing the wrong thing because they're not as smart as me, right? And then the other piece that I would add and answer is simply this. You asked about the technology. There was a really good interview with Philip Zimmerman, who's the inventor of PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, the other day. He was talking about the Lavabit shutdown, which is a silent email program. And essentially, he made the following point. Some of the technologies are incapable of being used without disclosing metadata about you. If we want email, you have to disclose who you want to send the mail to. Just doesn't work otherwise. We can anonymize things like internet browsing, right? Tor browser works quite well. We can bounce phone calls so that they're untraceable. That technology's been around for a while, and there's a company called Silent Circle that's building that. But some of the things that you want to use, that you love, right, that are free, right? You get Gmail for free. Come with a cost, right? And that's just an unsquarable circle. You can't change physics. You can't change the physics of the internet. Sorry.
Debbie?
To follow up on that point, like you said, most Americans want to do the right thing. Most American industry wants to do the right thing too. Same with the app industry. We've been diligent in doing what we can to have our industry set standards for itself in terms of privacy collection and following the rules and targeting consequences on the bad actors and to encourage those in Congress who may not be as educated about the tech industry, but to let them know that where they do want to set up rules and regulations, to do so cautiously, to make sure that they're doing it in a way that will continue to allow us to make those cool products. And yes, there are data collections that do take place in order to make the products that you like work. They would be very clunky if certain rules and regulations were imposed, and you wouldn't like that when you're trying to use OpenTable or Uber or different products that you love. They're not going to work as well. I think the point is really to have a clear set of rules and regulations that are applicable to the app industry or technologies, and we can all know what they are in terms of what's being collected and what's being used, and we can follow those rules, and you will be the beneficiary of amazing apps and continue to have those change your lives.
A quick point in defense of Debbie and the entire industry. I understand companies pretty much have to do when the government shows up at their door and says, you have to do this or else lots of people will die. I think our ire is best focused at the government than at the industry, which is really just trying to create cool products and make money, and this free market capitalist, nothing wrong with making money. To one of the things Paul had said, Eric Holder is not Darth Vader. He is Boba Fett, smuggling guns to Tatooine and Jabba hunt gangsters and stuff like that. The moment you stepped into Star Wars, you really went into my real area of expertise.
I'm sorry, I should not have challenged the Star Wars expert.
So, early in your comments, you'd said that the NSA's job is to steal other people's secrets, and I totally agree with it. Other people's secrets, not our secrets. We're not the bad guys. The whole purpose of it is to find what other people beyond American borders are saying. And so, the entire system of data mining that they have built begins with step one: gather everything you possibly can on absolutely everyone. Now, I am pretty sure that no one in this room is a terrorist. Pretty sure. And yet, if what we are told is correct, the NSA has collected tons of our data, and they aren't really doing anything with it, they tell us, but it's in there, it's in those databases, and that someday they're going to use the algorithms that look for, do you use the word bomb? We don't know what the algorithms are. We don't know what the search terms are. We don't know what the criteria that makes you kind of put a red flag up and say, okay, this is somebody worth looking at. Those algorithms might be really, really awesome. They might be really, really effective. Or they might have a whole bunch of false positives. We're in no place to know. So they're asking us to take an enormous amount on faith. Now, the problem here is there has never been a form of investigation or criminal process that has ever begun with step one, collect everything on everyone. The closest parallel you can come to is the concept of a general warrant, which was what the British did before the American Revolution, which was, look, if you're a British troop and you want to look in somebody's house, you want to look in somebody's business, you can do whatever you want because we're the British, we're in charge, and we can do this. And one of the explicit things banned in the Constitution was the idea of not doing this, because the whole point of the government's not supposed to have that authority. That if they're going to look at your stuff, they need probable cause. An NSA system in which step one is collect everything on everybody totally eradicates the concept of probable cause. So, while I'm really glad that this is not, that this stops terror attacks, I think we can say the system in which begins step one, have the government collect everything on everybody, it is totally untenable. And whoever the next NSA director is has to come up with a way to get similar results that doesn't require collecting everything on everybody, because you made the metaphor of the bad cop. Well, the level of danger from a bad cop is about here. The level of danger from a bad NSA director or a bad president is way up here. And you can imagine all kinds of abuses of that. So I remain unconvinced that the notion that we can't expect perfection, that's, okay. How about a little closer to perfection? How about halfway closer to perfection than what we have now, which is to take an enormous amount of data collection on faith and just hope that an administration that has, broken our trust time and time again won't ever abuse it the way they abuse the IRS.
So I would like to open up to questions, so if somebody has a question, if you want to raise your hand, and if, we got some microphones, so if you'd wait for the microphone, there's a question over here in the back. And if you would state your name and affiliation, and I think what I would love to do, if it'd be okay, is I'd like to have all the panel kind of address the question, so an open question that everybody can kind of jump on would be best, so please. It's okay, just talk.
Yeah.
No, use the microphone so people online can hear you. They'll just talk, it'll be fine.
Thank you for coming today. I think you all made very good points. The argument of the police officer was one that I wanted to focus on, because I think it makes very strange bedfellows with libertarians and like minority communities in New Orleans and Los Angeles when it talks about accountability of a police officer when they misuse power. Given the fact that most police officers that misuse power are not actually prosecuted or held accountable in any way, how would you say that this system is either better than that or could be improved upon?
So, I mean, and let's broaden the issue. Let's broaden the issue and talk about, accountability in general, that way everybody can kind of have a
Yeah, no,
comment, so.
look, the fact that our accountability system is not as good as it should be isn't a reason why we shouldn't have an accountability system or an indictment of the need for one or an excuse to eliminate the police officers. I mean, you're right, you're perfectly right, that in some police systems, the police accountability doesn't work. We're much better now than we were, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? That's been the arc of development in the United States. Is there more room for improvement? Absolutely. So where am I on that in terms of NSA? Same place, right? I mean, the fact that our systems don't work perfectly, even our accountability systems, doesn't surprise me. So what are the components of a good accountability system to the maximum extent you can? They're easy to identify. Independence, right? So external, some form. Transparency, right? So and accountability. The visiting of punishment upon those who violate those systems, right? And that's true whether it's the IRS, NSA, the police, your internal. Here in Heritage, you write a bad paper. There's got to be an accountability process for somebody to call you account. Not that I've ever written one of those.
We never had those.
No, yeah, we never have
do, I'm
those.
sure
Well,
we'll
no,
take care of it.
I mean, actually, it's a perfectly good answer because we have a rigorous pre and post, publication accountability process, and every once in a while, even Homer nods, right? Homer, the Greek.
Yeah, these are not the droids you're looking for.
Yeah, these are not the droids you're looking for. Exactly.
I think from our perspective, ACT is a member of the Digital Due Process Coalition and would support a warrant standard for when the government comes and knocks on our companies' doors. We want to have a better understanding of what we're supposed to give and how that, what the responsibilities and risks and legalities are.
To restore a sense of genuine accountability, I would really love to see somebody get fired. That none of this, they've been put on paid leave. Because you know what I call paid leave? Vacation, okay? When you basically, you get all the money you used to get for doing the job, but you don't have to actually do the job anymore. That's really not that much of a punishment. So when we hear about NSA employees snooping on ex-spouses, they say they've dealt with it, but we don't know whether that means, sit in the corner for 5 minutes, or whether you're not allowed to access that computer system anymore, or what, and we're asked to take it all on faith, which at this point is too much when we've seen it in other government agencies. A total breakdown of any culture of accountability. Now here's the thing, if there are laws on the books saying you should not be, using this program to snoop on your ex-spouse, and you use it, and you violate that law, let's get somebody prosecuted for this. Even if you make one or two examples, it's kind of broken windows theory, to go back to our good policeman. But in other words, if you see somebody getting punished for committing a crime, it makes everybody else stand up a little bit straighter and not as likely to break those laws. And I don't feel like in any of these cases of government misuse or mistrust or abuse of power, we've seen any serious consequences in a bunch of years.
Okay, so we have a question in the back and then down here in front. So we'll go in the back first. Yeah.
Yes, it was a question specifically for
Could you
Mr.
just state your name and affiliation,
Oh,
if
I'm
you
so
would?
sorry,
Thank
I'm
you.
not affiliated.
Well, that's okay.
My name is Elizabeth Graham. It's actually a question for Mr. Rosenzweig. I am perhaps confused, but I had understood that the NSA was supposed to spy on foreigners, and that the kerfuffle has to do with the fact that they're actually spying on, what was it, about 75% of us. So I don't see that as we're not perfect. I see that as we're quite appalling. What I would like to know is, what do you propose? What would you propose? And Jim, you can kick in here too, as well as Debbie. What would you propose be done immediately to address the fact that we have been spied upon, the data does exist, and in the absence of any further actions, that process is probably continuing?
Well, I guess I would start by fighting the premise of your question, right? No, it's not your fault. If you read only the Washington Post and the Guardian, you would be right, I think, in thinking that widespread NSA spying on the activities of American citizens is ongoing. I think, I would, kind of start with Jeff Stone, who's just been appointed by the president to the new Privacy Oversight Committee. So maybe but he was one of the most liberal professors I had in the University of Chicago. He was perfectly well inclined to critique the government programs, and he was quoted in I forget it was where, I think it was the Huffington Post the other day, that in his view, nothing what the NSA had done was illegal. To answer the question about why that's not why it hasn't been a wholesale spying on the activities of Americans, actually requires you to dig into the details of how these programs work. We've got 12 minutes. If you gave me an hour and a half, right, I could say it. So, but let's take a simple piece or a small piece and break it off. The collection of metadata of telephone calls, of all calls in the United States, so your metadata is collected, right, is an automated process, right? As I understand it, and again, it's not completely transparent, but I've read all of the releases from the Inspector Generals, there are exactly 22 people in government who are authorized to open up that data, look into it. They have made exactly 300 some odd number of queries of it in the last 10 years, all of which were subject to internal approvals and requirements, right? So, maybe you don't believe that, right? Maybe you think that the NSA is lying through its teeth, right? And that any Chaim Yankel in the entire agency can access this database whenever it wants and go searching for your telephone calls without so much as a by your leave from your superior, and that they do it every day. Or maybe that's your fear going forward in the future, right? Either one of those is a reasonable position to take. Neither of them is the one that I would take. My assumption is that in general, the checks and balances of a system that we put in place like that work. That having been said, I would stop the government's metadata program, collection program, precisely because it does involve data about American citizens. And I don't think it's essential. I think 300 times in 10 years kind of demonstrates its disutility in an odd way, right? So for me, I wouldn't be that upset if we gave away that program, and maybe that seems to be the one that's been the most enraging to most American citizens, including apparently Jim, right? So that I probably want to think about it more and know a little bit more about what those 300 queries were and what they produced and how effective they've been. There's some dispute about whether or not they've been part and parcel of stopping some terrorist activity. I'd like somebody to tell me that they've looked at it in detail. I hope the President's new commission will, and then tell us.
Debbie?
From an industry perspective, we would any response to any of these issues where there might be legislative or regulatory changes, we would have the tech industry at the table so that the decision makers would understand how those decisions may impact legitimate businesses and make sure that this exploding industry that it's a huge export as well, isn't somehow damaged in the process, and that we focus on the bad actors, not legitimate business.
I think both Congress and the public would be pretty darn reasonable if, when they talk about, well, yes, we gather, look, we understand there's gonna be some inadvertent, or if you're chasing bad guys will come here. And so a guy who you were listening to his cell phone when he was overseas is now in the United States. Look, we understand that. You're listening to a phone call and one person's inside the United States and the other person's overseas. Look, how reasonable. If, let's say, one guy is named Nadal Hassan and he's in the army and he's talking to a guy named Al-Waki over his internet. Look, we understand that there are gonna be cases where you're gonna have to listen to Americans. So I think, both Congress and the public would be reasonable. And if every one of these cases, it turned out, look, here's why we thought, at this point, we're being asked to take all of this on faith. And maybe all those 300 cases are perfectly hunky-dory, but the phrase Chaim Yokel?
Chaim Yankel.
Okay, I assume it's a yokel or any
Yeah.
any old schmo?
Yeah.
Any old schmo, like, say, Ed Snowden, who'd been there a month and suddenly got keys to the kingdom, had access to all kinds of good stuff.
But he didn't. He didn't have access to the database. He had access to descriptions of the database. That's the reason why we know about this, yes, right? But he did not. He said he did, but he didn't. And in fact, if he had brought out the database itself, Glenn Greenwald would have published it by now, right? For sure, right? He'd have said what he did with it.
Okay, so we're gonna try to squeeze in one more question and then give everybody an opportunity for a last round of comments. So sir, you have the last question, and if it's brief, then we can really have a fulsome end here.
My name is John Connell, and I'm a retired congressman and investment banker. I think most of us would agree with Jim Girardi that Lois Lerner's and the others and so forth ought to be sacked rather than be put on paid leave. That's obviously ridiculous. I think most of us in America are not that concerned about the privacy of NSA or anyone else snooping on our data. We're not sleeping with someone else's wife. We're not involved in a fraudulent operation. We're not running a conspiracy against the government. If we need something for business transactions, we encrypt it. Everything else is garbage on Twitter or other stuff. What you said earlier, I have a problem with. You said that the government, the national security people, should get a warrant when they have reasonable suspicion about somebody. How in the world are they going to have any reasonable suspicion of what terrorists are doing unless they're doing some listening function? How are they going to identify them? Those guys don't hang their name out in public in Al Jazeera. They're working undercover. There has to be some investigation work, doesn't it? And doesn't that require overall mining?
Okay, so again, yeah, let's just run down. Everybody can have their comment about how we're gonna do, what kind of investigative authorities are appropriate, so.
So I didn't see in my notes where I was gonna call for the shutting down of the NSA, put a giant padlock on the door and shut it down. My whole point was being deeply upset about the idea of listening in on the metadata and all this other information about Americans. If you're doing overseas, now as I said, I even said once you go across the border. However, I get very troubled when you start we're gonna start by looking at Americans, which is what this program effectively does. Now the second thing is that the commenting about people having affairs or engaged in fraudulent activity, it sounds way too similar to, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. And I get very nervous whenever anybody who's affiliated with the government says, no, don't worry, as long as you're not doing anything wrong, there's nothing wrong with us looking into this. Because the whole point is, look, as we said, I hate to keep coming back to the IRS scandal, but the point is that if the IRS, which is supposed to be operating in a nonpartisan fashion, can totally break, we haven't had any heroes come forth in the IRS scandal to say, Lois Lerner told me to look at this stuff and I said no. I said it was wrong and I resigned my job rather than do that. And so when people said, there's a whole question in the IRS debate, scandal debate, or whether it goes back to Obama. It's actually more troubling if it doesn't go back to Obama, if there's no order from on high saying, you have to go look at these Tea Party Americans, they're nefarious and bad, and we think they're probably terrorists, and look in their financial data. It is much, much worse because it says the entire culture of the organization has been corrupted, an entire sense of do what you have to do, that there's nothing wrong with judging Americans based on their political beliefs. Now, if that can happen at the IRS, I don't understand why we just take it on faith that that could never happen at the NSA or any other related government agency that has these kinds of authorities. you know, again, like, I think it's way too, I think it's disingenuous to characterize this as a choice between shutting down the NSA or keeping it as it is. And I, like our president, I reject the false choice between these two paths, and I choose the sensible middle path.
Debbie?
Oh, I'm out on that one.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I reject that false choice too. I'm going to actually kind of change my tack a bit in response and say and answer you this way. I actually think that in the end, metadata is a very rich source of information about people. That's precisely why Google collects it, right? Because they learn a great deal about your preferences, and it is equally true that the government can learn about your preferences. I think I agree with Jim, that we're saddled with laws that were designed before this technology. I mean, the underlying privacy rules go back to 1974, when, you know, Apple was a glimmer in Steve Jobs' eye, and not the world-bestriding giant that it is right now. What I object to is the nature of the current debate about where the new laws should be struck being essentially a rush to the scariest demagoguing denominator, right? You know that, you know, I mean, I don't want to make light of it, but we can't approach that debate with skepticism about government's fidelity, but we can't approach it with such a degree of skepticism that we cannot accept any of the current institutions as effective in resetting that balance. I would actually be in favor of Congress revisiting the Privacy Act, you know, resetting the balance, perhaps defining metadata under the same standards as the content of phone calls, right? If that's where we want to go with this. But that would be something that should be something we do not under the pressure of a media-created firestorm by a Nimrod who's decided that he wants to go live in Russia, but rather kind of the product of mature debate. Mature debate in Congress. It is hard. It is hard, but they can do it. I mean, they really can rouse themselves when they need to, and this is one of the times when I think they do need to.
So
I'll end there.
if I could fulfill my obligation to get you out here exactly on time and just sum up and then ask you to join me in thanking the panel. First of all, I thought this was a really excellent discussion in the sense that, you know, having been deeply involved in this issue for a long time, to get as much of the debate out on the table in the time you guys and in a clear and kind of unwonky way, I thought was pretty awesome. So I think you guys did great. The other thing is, and you can yell at me later, but I do sense kind of 2 points of consensus among the panel.
No.
And one is this, you know, kind of, you know, and I wouldn't say transparency, there's honestly differences on that, but this craving for kind of clarity of accountability and responsibility. And I do think that that's something where reforms that are rooted in, or changes that are rooted in that, there's some common ground. The other thing is, there's a point not to be missed, which is, and which I do think there's agreement in the panel, is just because all the information in the universe is out there doesn't necessarily mean that we think government should retain or have access to or retain all the information in the universe. And so the question is what portion of that is appropriate for them to do their legitimate duties of governance and responsibility and looking after us. And that's actually a great starting point for the way forward on these programs. And I hope somebody that's still in Congress is out there listening to that discussion. And if those 2 points, I think, were the starting points of going forward, I think we could actually make great strides in our progress to keep a society which is both safe and free. So please join me in thanking our panel, and thank you for coming.